hi everyone. So this is the beginning of the live Q&A on tokenization. So following Sebastian's presentation on tokenized assets as a catalyst for private markets digitization. And then we just had a discussion on a deep dive really on tokenized shares as a case study for SMEs, with really deep diving further into the Audacia business case. Now we are really open to take any of your questions, so feel free to write them, and then we will address them. So I guess we can wait. We will wait and then take them one by one.
Yeah, so everyone understood everything. No open questions. While we're waiting for the first questions, we can discuss the latest developments among ourselves. No tricky questions coming in.
If needed, I have a question for you, Fedor.
Go ahead, fire away.
So no, I think one very interesting point in Switzerland is that we had the chance to have the DLT changes entering into force on the 1st of February of this year, okay, which is already, I think, a strong and very good catalyst for tokenization of shares of Swiss corporations. So from a legal standpoint, where do you see next steps, and do you believe that we have already everything that is needed, or do you still believe that there are some important changes from a legal standpoint that needs to be taken?
Look, it's a good question. I think from the perspective of just using ledger-based securities by issuers, whether for shares, debt, or whatever, we have the framework already. So this is it works. The additional small adjustments in the law, which will, I expect that to enter into force in, August, September. We don't have the final date, but originally it was anticipated for August. That will round up everything, including this, segregation in case of bankruptcy, custody, and improve security on that front. But without looking into the specific infrastructure, the DLT securities infrastructure with specific features that cater for the specificities of trading assets that are based or live on blockchains. Apart from that, the rest is already there. The question marks will be, how it can be recognized internationally when you trade that outside Switzerland. There are international private law provisions that allow Switzerland to recognize things and parties to submit to Swiss law. So ultimately, foreign issuers that cannot use their local law for debt, for instance, could very well leverage Swiss law by just submitting their issuance to Swiss law, because it will be valid and recognized under Swiss law, and then the Swiss court judgment potentially will be recognized in their jurisdiction. So that's feasible. There are other means to do that as well, by using depository receipts or something like that.
Perfect. I think it's There is just a question, Fedor, and I think it's an extension of this.
Indeed. So I'll read the question so everyone can hear that. So it's, several EU-based companies would like to benefit from the Swiss regulatory framework to unlock liquidity for their employees and investors. There is the CSDR law that requires a CSD, but it seems you can do without it. Well, in Switzerland, and that's the nice element under Swiss regulation, is for organized trading facilities, the Swiss law does not require a CSD. So under Swiss law, when you have a trading facility, so organized trading facility run by a bank or securities dealer, it's not per se an infrastructure, but it's a trading facility run by a regulated entity. That particular trading facility does not need an additional infrastructure element, so a central security depository. And this is an advantage in a sense over EU regulation, where in order to trade on a regulated trading facility, they absolutely need the financial instruments to be held with a CSD. I mean, I think there have been attempts to go to regulators in the EU to try to circumvent that, simply because it's not feasible or desirable in many instances, but I am not aware of any of those attempts being successful. However, and it's not a circumvention per se. I mean, the EU-based companies or other international companies can use not only the Swiss facility to essentially move to a ledger-based security, whatever financial instruments they issue, but also leverage the Swiss trading venue and infrastructure. And the more trading venues there will be, and the more they will be interconnected, the more liquidity that can give in terms of potential, at least access to those. I think, Sebastien, perhaps you can comment on that as well. I mean, for as long as those OTFs are sort of open and can interconnect, that will technically increase the liquidity pool, at least.
Oh, definitely. I think that's the value also of the DLT, is that technically it will allow you in the future to pool several liquidity pools or trading venues, for trading facilities. And that's where I see the full potential of those kind of technologies, is that if you admit for trading a tokenized security for, let's say, on TDX, for example, you know that you can also admit it for trading in different jurisdictions, by the way. And I think that's the interesting element, is that you could admit it for trading in Switzerland with us, maybe in the future. If another jurisdiction is also supportive, why not also admit it for trading in Thailand, for example? I don't know, at the same time. And the beauty is that we'll share this, if it's a securities-based ledger, for example, booked on a public mainnet. So by definition, they could also connect and use the same fungible token, which is something quite interesting. Because I saw also some difference, because, for example, in the classical world, we have dual listing for a company. And when you do dual listing also in different jurisdictions, technically the securities are not really fungible. It's two different securities. But the beauty also of the technology in our case is that it's going to be the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And potentially it actually goes beyond that. It's not like you have dual admission to trading. If you cannot admit it to trading in a jurisdiction because of CSD or whatever, you could have a broker, for instance, from that jurisdiction, allowing its own clients to actually access and trade without having a trading venue in their jurisdiction, which might not be possible. But the more brokers connect to trading venues, and if there are interconnection between trading venues, it will just create a network. And the larger the network, the larger the liquidity pool.
Indeed, you are totally right. And that's why also for us, for example, in our case, we focused a lot on connecting banks and even traditional securities dealer, and making sure they are properly equipped to support the trading and settlement of those kind of securities. Because I think that's the best way to leverage the scale of the ecosystem in a regulated and efficient manner. I think there is another question in the Q&A, Fedor.
Indeed. What type of companies are interested and what are they looking for? That's a fairly general question, which is nice. I think we've seen an evolution. I think there have been a change or sort of move towards more non-technical sort of focused companies. The original ones were companies focused on technological solution, etc., that were interested in leveraging that, etc., and so forth. Then they have been and there still are ideas to try to leverage blockchain and tokenization of digital assets for like real estate, funds, etc. And there are sort of limitations that have nothing to do with the technology and that the technology doesn't really necessarily solve. And there are interesting projects which, you know, normally if they go live would allow after certain clarifications to perhaps facilitate access and improve liquidity of certain otherwise non-liquid investments. You need to be careful though with private equity funds, for instance, and that type of projects, that you don't change the product actually. You cannot just magically create really liquidity. You need to understand the underlying product. But there have been attempts to do that, and some projects went live. So it's perhaps it will be picking up as we go along. And more recently, we've had also interest in access to tokenization by just regular companies that have a business that has nothing to do with technology at all, but they just realize that they're not big enough to do an IPO, or they just don't want the hassle or the cost of running public. They don't see as an attractive sort of financing route by approaching venture capital, etc., or banks. And they still want to give the potential to, especially companies that have employees participation schemes, they want to go for them a possibility to potentially trade. And the company doesn't want to run an internal market itself. I've known as certain companies that have shadow participation schemes that then run an internal market, which is very difficult to do and requires a lot of resources. And those companies could just, now that the tokenization and the technology behind is now more mature, and you have mature players that are regulated that can safely accompany those projects, it's fairly easy to just use ledger-based securities rather than keep your own securities ledger in-house or on paper. It's actually more secure and has the added advantage, subject to certain cost considerations, of course. You need to have a certain size for it to make sense, just to have a trading venue with perhaps liquidity, which will improve as we go along. So that trend, I think, is picking up, and TDX, for instance, has seen a couple of issues already, and there are, I suppose, others in the pipeline. But it's all a question of trust, and we're talking about trust in innovation. I think that's a fairly good point. For as long as it's perceived as totally novel, probably some people will say, "Oh, I don't want to be the guinea pig." But now that there have been companies that have done that and I've seen the benefits, in a couple of years' time, I would see this becoming mainstream, so to speak. Like smaller or mid-sized companies will not necessarily think about, how to issue my shares. I mean, it's not choosing the quality of the paper on which to print the certificate or the safe where to put them. Just go to one of the service providers and you can do it. I think another point to add to that, which I think is also relevant, is this standardization, and that will drive also adoption and trust as well. I mentioned the Capital Markets and Technology Association, and Sébastien also and Taurus are doing a lot of work at the CMTA to promote common standards within the industry, which is kind of very powerful, because when you have competitors joining forces, from various aspects of the value chain and saying, we need to have a standard as something uniform. That will also promote trust.
So definitely, Fedor, I think it's you are totally right. It's very interesting to see that at the beginning it was mainly tech companies, because those tech companies, they could do it by themselves, even not the trading, but they could. If you master the tech, potentially, if you're a blockchain company, you would do yourself your own token. It's not so complex ultimately. And then, of course, then they had the issue about how to exchange it. So they were using DEX, decentralized exchange, which is an issue for some institutional investors and high quality investors. But now there are some providers that we see also classical players entering the field. So now it's totally possible for a company who has not the knowledge and expertise to do it, to work with the right partner and to do it in a very fast and easy way, knowing now that the first pioneer did it and the process starts to be more and more simple, standardized, and known by all the parties around the table. And I think that's the supportive elements. But it's also, we are still at the beginning of this. It's still not mainstream, definitely. We are still at the beginning. And now what is important, that's now the right tools and infrastructure are in place, the right regulatory framework. Now we need at the same time good issuer, a good quality issuer entering the space, as well as and more investor will come, and inversely, the more investor will come, the more high quality issuers will also enter the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also a point that people shouldn't see those new trading venues and the technology as essentially trying to replace the existing, listed markets. That will not happen overnight. It's just impossible, because if for this to happen, like the whole infrastructure on the planet will need to be changed within a short period of time. If people remember how difficult it was to go from T+5 to T+3, and the preparations for that around the globe to make sure that everything runs smoothly and we don't lose information or trades. Fairly similar. I mean, I don't even think that it's actually necessarily will improve the existing markets. They work today. I mean, let's not break something that works. But for the segment that is below IPO, for various reasons, they might be large or they might be smaller. But those who are below that range, that's where there is a new niche which essentially will allow to benefit that. And for other products that are not necessarily listed products are fine. I mean, it's a streamlined process. People know how it works. They could potentially improve the back office operations and sort of have some automation, digitalization. But for products that are traded over the counter, for instance, mostly, or are not listed but still are out there, it's a lot of manual work when you have transfer agents, CSD, or whatever. And those can be replaced. Those can be replaced, at least in part, by other service providers that will use technology to run the services in a cheaper and safer manner.
See there another question, Fedor.
That's probably for you.
Okay. So which stage of growth would you recommend for a company to tokenize your shares and admit them for trading? Is it more for startups, scale-ups? So for me, I make the difference between two elements. There is the tokenization and there is the admission for trading, which are in fact two different part of the equation. So for tokenization, technically, you can do it at any moment. So you can do it at the creation of a startup already. You can do it later. You can even tokenize and de-tokenize the shares, or even tokenize some shares and not the full shares, and inversely. So tokenization at any moment, but of course, tokenization per se is not an end. And I think the beauty also of tokenization is to admit it for trading. So I think the key element to the question is what kind of company can get it admitted for trading. So I'm just looking in the case of TDX. So for us, I would say it's rather for scale-ups, simply because we have some minimum admission criteria for corporations. Of course, we could change them in the future, but as of today, we require a minimum 2 years of operation for the company. And we require typically also to have audited financial statements. It can be limited audit, doesn't need to be full ordinary audit. And we also require a minimum turnover as indicated on my presentation. So as you can see, it's rather for scale-ups than pure startups starting from scratch day one. But what we observe is that we have more and more discussion with startups who understand the criteria for the admission of trading, but they already want to tokenize or they already want to prepare for tokenization with the view to being admitted, for example, in 1.5 years or 2 years, and to potentially offer better liquidity and advantages to their investor, and also to strengthen their capital raising story towards potential investors. I don't know, Fedor, if you have anything to add.
No, I think that makes sense. I think the only question then that comes to mind is it long, and how do you do it?
To do the tokenization?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know that like me, so tokenization, there are two elements. There is the legal structuring part, and there is the technology side. So from a legal standpoint, you know better than me, Fedor. So you need to do a couple of adjustments to your article association to make sure that since day one you did it properly. But it's nothing complex, I would say. And then once you have done it, from a pure tech perspective, it's very fast. It's technically in a couple of minutes, hours. Just need to prepare properly to better understand what kind of shares you want to issue. Do you want restricted share, non-restricted shares? So there are a couple of key questions. But once you have done it properly from a legal standpoint, article of association, I think then it can be a very fast process, could be even done the same day.
Absolutely. And from the legal perspective, I think in a base case scenario, using the CMTA blueprint, which provides the various articles, clauses, plus board resolutions, etc., and regulations, it works. And it's just a matter of if you need to change the articles, to set up an appointment with the notary, and then off you go. And once you have the board that has resolved to transform the shares into ledger-based securities, you're done. You're basically done. In real life, you need a little bit more preparation to plan ahead and understand what you will want to have. And I think it's a good segue to the other questions we've just received, which refers to existing shareholders in SMEs who want to secure the shareholding structure of their company by sort of restricting transfers, access to shareholding to competitors or other people. And such limitation mechanisms are typically set forth in shareholder agreements, like you have the preemption rights, right of first refusal, drag along, tag along, you name it. And the question is whether once you tokenize shares, can you tackle this? And of course, there are two layers. One is legal and one is technological. So on the legal layer, I mean, it doesn't matter whether your shares are issued as ledger-based securities or on paper or whatever. You can still have your shareholders agreement in place and technically restrictions. However, the restrictions, and Sebastian can comment from a technological point of view, you'll issue your shares as ledger-based securities, and then you'll essentially code operating provisions of your shareholders agreement as a separate application layer or smart contract for all or part of the shares, actually. So it depends how you want to implement it. Some things can be implemented inside the share, like transfer restrictions. It's statutory and based on articles. Contractual things can be just coded in a separate smart contract above the base layer. So from that perspective, using ledger-based securities is actually, in a sense, can be more flexible because you have the added benefit of essentially coding the provisions. You'll need to be careful, though, of course, to make sure that you have some control layers in case of dispute and to change any provisions you've coded because you didn't anticipate anything. But that's also solvable. There are projects that aim to resolve that and to implement resolution through off-chain arbitration that is then implemented on-chain through various mechanisms. And I think everything, the technology is there. I mean, whatever you can code, it's like, it's not code is law, but I'm not from that angle, but you can code all the operating provisions and get the benefit of those shareholders agreements.
I think also what we see is that from a technical perspective, it's totally feasible to code advanced mechanism, but it's true at this stage, we still see very simple shares practically to be issued, because if you start to do something that is too complex, you start to have non-standardized contracts that are more difficult to be supported by different parties. And ultimately, if you start to restrict or code very complex restriction mechanism or so on, it's also difficult to implement practically to admit it for trading on a marketplace, where ultimately, if somebody trades it, is blocked. And it needs again to go via a process to be admitted and so on. So that's really, I think, also an interesting trade-off to be thought about. That's what you're also trying to explain to some companies, is that if you want to be still a private company, but to be admitted for trading, by definition, you will need to do some effort, potentially in terms of transferability, potentially also in terms of transparency. You will need to publish minimum some audited accounts, for example. So you need to be also ready for that. There are pros, but there are also some minor cons to be taken into consideration when taking such a decision.
Yeah, you could actually question whether it makes sense, if you want to keep everything private in a small circle, whether you need to use the ledger-based securities, because if you want to lock everything in by contract, etc., maybe you're better off just with standard things and escrow arrangements, like in a analog world. But other than that, if you want to keep a core structure where it's blocked among the founders, for instance, but allow other shareholders to have liquidity, you can split shares. You have different classes of shares. You tokenize one part, but not the rest. I mean, everything is possible from a flexibility perspective.
Indeed, Fedor, one of the classical ways to typically use also participation certificates, which are non-voting shares that are recognized also typically in the Swiss law. So of course, there are limitations. Participation certificates cannot represent more than X% of the total share capital structure. But that's also an interesting way, and you would say, okay, I tokenize the participation shares. So much easier in terms of governance. They cannot vote, but they can be freely transferable. That's why, for example, an example. So then we had, I think, again, some questions regarding the process, but I think we covered them. Or maybe, Fedor, do you want to explain first a little bit more from a legal perspective, and then I explain what we need to do on the TDX side?
Yeah, but from a legal perspective, as we already, I think, mentioned, I think if someone wants to tokenize shares and then be admitted on TDX, first you need to do the legal prep work to actually be able to do that. And it's a small adjustment. You need to change the articles to have a clause that allows that. Then the board has to resolve to issue shares as ledger-based securities based on the revised legislation, and then you simply have to release that. The process, again, from a legal perspective, is fairly straightforward. It is described in the blueprint that's open source and available, on the CMTA side. Then on TDX side, I guess you have an admission regulation, which is fairly straightforward, and issuers will have just to follow the steps.
Indeed. So as I said, we have minimum conditions. So 2 years of operation, typically minimum 5 million turnover, audited financial statement for the last 2 years. That's the minimum criteria. If you match those criteria, we still need to make a due diligence just to make sure that you have properly issued the shares according to the law, that the smart contract is also one of the smart contracts and one of the blockchain that we have recognized, and that we believe we are comfortable. And if all those steps are met, then we do minimum due diligence also about the firm who is behind, and so on. But then it's a question about deciding what kind of liquidity mechanism do we want to offer, because we have several options there. You could imagine, for example, to have continuous trading, which is the classical way to do trading, but we are also offering, for example, auction-based mechanism, where you can have monthly auctions, weekly auctions, quarterly options, annual auctions, depending also on the liquidity that we can forecast for a specific kind of security. And when everything is agreed, we simply sign what we call a trading admission agreement that is summarize the duties of both parties for those kind of transactions. So I think we are coming.
No, I think we are coming to an end, exactly, because the time has passed. So thank you everyone for joining in. You know where to find us on taurushq.com, t-dx.com for the exchange. Thank you a lot, Fedor. Thank you a lot, Sébastien. Thank you a lot also Trust in Innovation team, Caroline and Adeline, for the great work. And I think that's it for today. So thanks a lot, and talk to you soon. So just one last thing, we will have covering on the Café Remo, which is an event that will last from 11:30 to 3:30, and we will be covering from a Taurus side 2 tables. So one focusing on security and technology with our VP of engineering in the morning, and then our CSO, so Sébastien Pache in the morning, and Dr. Jean-Philippe Aumasson in the afternoon. And I will be covering the Taurus business and use cases on a separate table if you have any questions on tokenization or any cryptocurrencies management question. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. Thank you, Fedor.
Thank you, everyone.